the road to net zero is unpaved and getting steeper by the day. If we have any hope of reaching the end of that road, the world needs to invest in a clean energy system to help take us there. Now, policies that increase the cost of emissions, such as a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, are key for incentivizing that switch towards a cleaner energy system and incentivizing the investment in that clean energy system. Now, this switch will have macroeconomic implications, so it's important to try to understand what those implications might be. And it can be very tempting to try to equate an increase in the carbon price to a standard oil price shock, because both tend to increase the cost of fossil fuel energy. But there are very important differences to keep in mind. For example, a traditional oil price shock or energy price shock tends to increase the revenues of fossil fuel producers and suppliers, whereas a carbon tax or a carbon price increase should increase the revenues of the state. And then those revenues can be recycled back into the economy in ways that offset some of the macroeconomic costs or go towards the hardest hit sectors. Another difference is that a traditional energy price shock is seen as temporary, and it's something that's usually unexpected, whereas a carbon price increase should be something that is gradually implemented and raised and should be seen as a permanent policy feature. So if implemented well and designed well and communicated well, then a carbon price increase can incentivize investment towards a clean energy system and away from traditional fossil fuel investment. Now, these differences are especially interesting in a current context where we've recently had an energy price shock, an energy crisis caused by the invasion of Ukraine. And at the same time, we are also facing a narrowing window in which we have time to ensure an orderly and smooth transition to a cleaner energy system. So we have a push from some policymakers towards higher carbon prices. So we have both at play at the same time. And this makes it interesting to look at trends in energy investment and what we actually see playing out. And so the IEA has a recent report on energy investments from 2021 through 2023. And what this report highlights is that investments in clean energy are actually now outpacing investments in fossil fuels. And if this trend were to continue, according to this report, this would put clean energy investments on track to reach the IEA's announced pledges scenario. And that's not quite net zero, but it's better than nothing. Now, it's important to recognize that there are still many obstacles that remain. There are, for example, differences in investment by region, with a lot of this investment in clean energy coming from China, Europe, and the US, and a lot of investment needs still existing for developing economies. We also see some interesting dynamics with investments in fossil fuels coming from fossil fuel suppliers. So on the one hand, we see that the share of profits from fossil fuel producers being invested back into traditional fossil fuels has declined significantly compared to, say, 5 years ago. Now, because of their windfall profits in 2022, this still represents an increase in investments in fossil fuels, but the decreasing share could reflect some acknowledgement or reflection of the expected increase of carbon pricing that's expected, and that investors want to avoid the risk of stranded assets. And we see something interesting playing out also in the EU in terms of planned infrastructure for LNG import infrastructure. And so that's a type of investment that's been made in recent years because of concerns about energy security. But it also risks becoming something either that locks in carbon emissions or becomes a stranded asset as we work towards net zero goals. So overall, what we see is that we do indeed have both a traditional energy shock playing out in the economy at the same time as something, as people expect a higher carbon price because of the policy initiatives towards net zero. And what becomes clear when we look at how actual energy investment is playing out is that clear and credible communication on the continued rising cost of carbon and rising cost of emissions is key towards continuing to incentivize the switch to a cleaner energy system.